great advantages of working in the RUSI library is that you get to see and read a lot of really interesting books that come across the table. And I've been fairly fortunate recently. Someone donated Christopher Pine's book called The Insider. Now, whether you like him or loathe him, in that book he's got a really important chapter that talks about the role that the federal government decided to take in fundamentally reshaping Australia's industry base by the build-up of Australia's military capability. And from the period of the 2016 Defence White Paper, there's a really serious number of achievements, including the formation of an integrated investment plan, the increase in defence expenditure to 2% of GDP, the Defence Industry Policy Statement, creation of the Centre for Defence Industry Capability, the Defence Innovative Hub, the Next Generation Technology Fund, the Naval Shipbuilding Plan. It's an impressive list of achievements. And how defence industry, and in particular the higher education sector, responds to these challenges is actually going to be vital to reshaping our industrial base. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Air Vice Marshal Kim Osley, AMCSC, who's the recently appointed New South Wales Defence Industry Advocate. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul, and I also acknowledge the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, as the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and acknowledge their and pay respects to elders past and present. I'd like to thank Professor Michael Howell for putting together such a great roundtable today, the chance to actually talk through some of these very important issues, and great to catch up with Mark and Joe and others there that I haven't seen in quite a while. And, so having face to face is just fantastic. And for once, I'm actually wearing pants. Just not bad.
James should be certified.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I think what people need to realise, and I think Paul sort of started on that track, is that defence industry is now a big part of defence capability. Defence industry is larger than any of the services out there. So we're talking about 40,000 or more people spread across defence industry Australia-wide, 26,000 or so in New South Wales. So it is a really, really big deal. And I think that defence industry, it supports national resilience and defence resilience in a number of ways. It sustains the defence force. No one on the front row here would be confident to go out on any of their platforms if their defence industry folk didn't guarantee the seaworthiness, airworthiness and landworthiness of those platforms that they operate. Gone are the days when uniformed people sustained all of the capabilities. Innovation and development of future capabilities is very much in the hands of defence industry and increasingly Australian defence industry. And hopefully we will end up having a lot more sovereign capabilities and have less reliance on the IP of overseas sources. Defence industry does contribute quite strongly to the Australian economy through exports, although not as much as we would like, and hopefully we'll see movement on that in the future. And also, very importantly, defence industry provides workforce skills, innovation and key intellectual property within Australia that defence will rely on in the future. If I go back to my when I first joined the Air Force in 1977, the Air Force was something like 27,000 people. So about double what it is now. I think roughly 14,500 now. So about double. We were nowhere nearly as capable as what Joe outlined his force can do now. It's amazing. You know, We could not have deployed the aeroplanes that Joe spoke about in those task forces. They would have been fitted for but not with. We had lots of people in uniform that were doing deeper maintenance and doing support tasks, but not as many at the pointy end. We certainly didn't have this concept of preparedness and the ability to go out the door, fire the gun and keep firing the gun for a long period of time. So I think we've advanced a long way since then. Defence industry is truly a critical enabler for defence and fundamental input to capability. The New South Wales Defence Industry Strategy is a little bit dated. It's 2017, and you can see a copy of it up there on the right-hand side of the screen. However, and there have been a number of things that have changed since it, but a lot of the strategies within it are still quite relevant. A comment was made at the break that New South Wales doesn't seem to be as vocal about defence industry as perhaps South Australia, Tasmania or Western Australia. And I think that's because you need to consider that New South Wales, the commercial base, the industrial base is quite large, and defence industry only represents about 1.7%. So if the Minister's going to talk for, or the Premier's going to talk for a while, then about 1.7% of the time it's going to be about defence industry. In South Australia, of course, defence industry is very important. My father worked for Holden's, and I think you can understand why I think that, and I'm a South Australian by birth. So defence industry is going to feature differently across the states and territories in the dialogue. However, I do tell you that it is very important for the New South Wales Government that we get good defence outcomes and that we support the Defence Force. The key strategies, and I'll just quickly run through just a couple of examples. So the first one, foster stronger relationships with defence. And I'll use as an example here the fact that we have defence industry networks and precincts established all around New South Wales. I come from an Air Force background, so I'll use Williamtown as an example. We have the Williamtown precinct up there. It has British Aerospace in it. It has it has Martin Baker that makes ejection seats. It has a lot of both OEM sort of level representation. It has the next small, medium enterprise representation. It has a full ecosystem, and it's important that you have that ecosystem, and it needs to be near the operators. It can't be necessarily hundreds of kilometres away. I know Joe as CO3 and Commander Air Combat Group and all the other people would like to reach out and touch the people that are supporting their platforms and their aeroplanes. So what New South Wales does by establishing those precincts is provide that centre of gravity. I think also New South Wales is leveraging its strengths in responding to critical defence capability areas. And I think one of the speakers earlier today mentioned that everything is aligned very well between the top and the bottom. Probably that was you, Joe. And I think one thing that Joe didn't mention was the sovereign industrial capability priorities. So that defence doesn't leave it to the guesswork of industry, they actually spell out 14 areas and they say, foot stomp, these are the areas that you really need to focus on. If you do nothing else, develop capability in these areas and we'll be happy. Not only that, they identify an industrial plan to go with each of those capabilities, and New South Wales is certainly responding to those. And if I look at just a couple of areas, so some of those sovereign industrial capability priorities are, for instance, submarine technology. And there's obviously many areas that New South Wales is getting involved in that. Skilling the workforce, including nuclear engineering. University of New South Wales is key in nuclear engineering and management. Potential sustainment of submarines within New South Wales. The potential for an East Coast submarine base is certainly something that's under active consideration. And then research and development activities that came out of the Australia, UK, US announcement. So on the 16th of September, everyone heard nuclear submarines. Less people heard artificial intelligence, cyber capabilities, quantum computing, long-range and hypersonic missiles, and underwater systems. I heard that because that's what New South Wales is great at, and we've got obviously Alex and others will talk about that. Another area is space, and I notice we've got Fleet Commander, Forces Commander, Air Commander. Next year you're going to have Space Commander. So we'll have Kath Roberts maybe along here as well, and Air Vice Marshal Kath Roberts. Defence is establishing a space division, and they've chosen well in having Air Vice Marshal Kath Roberts as the first commander of the sort of the space area. New South Wales has much more space-related workforce and companies than any other state or territory in Australia, so obviously we have a key role here. And the 2020 New South Wales Space Industry Development Strategy does highlight that. The one thing I would like to mention though is space is one of those areas where there's a common ground between commercial and defence. And so when we talk about resilience and all the rest of it, a lot of the defence resilience in space will come from access to commercially available space. And so what you're going to see, what change, you're going to see at Joint Operations Command, you'll start to see a lot of commercial space capabilities being considered by the joint planning staff as they plan operations. And those people will need to have their efforts coordinated as well. The guided weapons enterprise is a classic case where the government has decided, Defence has decided, that they no longer want to source all guided weapons from overseas, higher-end guided weapons. So in the past, we bought all up rounds through foreign military sales from the US or through other mechanisms from other countries. Going forward, the aim of that guided weapons enterprise, and we've got a couple of hard-working one-stars down in Canberra running their team to do this, is that they want to have the supply chain assured for guided weapons. That doesn't mean we're going to make everything in Australia, but it does mean between stockpiling, making some stuff, contributing to global supply chains, we're going to put together, I guess, a tapestry of how we're going to actually make this work and get more assurance for our pointy-end folk in their guided weapons availability. And I think New South Wales is well placed. We have Orchard Hills that has been doing guided weapons storage and maintenance for a long time out near on the outskirts of Western Sydney. We've got Mulwala making explosives materials, and we've got Lithgow making hardware for some of the ammunition and that. And there's a lot of people that are thinking about setting up in New South Wales under the guided weapons enterprise. The last one I'll quickly talk about is integrated air and missile defence. And I've chosen that one because that's a classic case where it's not so much about missiles flying around. We're probably going to, we'll go to tender and we'll get missile companies that will respond with that. What's really, really key about that integrated air and missile defence is the smarts behind it. It's about the system integration. In the past, like with the F-35, where was the system integration for the F-35? Fort Worth. Where was the system integration for other things? Overseas. But with the integrated air and missile defence, we actually have a desire to establish that Australian systems integration capability. And I think it will be a really important one, not just for blue suiters or air combat folk, but it'll be important for the Navy and Army and for all projects going forward that we have a sovereign capability where we can do our own systems integration and we aren't reliant on overseas for that capability. Great. Just I'd like to quickly finish with a couple of key challenges for Australian defence industry, and obviously the first one is supply chain resilience, and that is, I think we learned a lot during the COVID lockdown. I'm a director, in addition to being a New South Wales Defence Advocate, I am a director on a New South Wales Defence company, and I experienced at first hand impacted freight arrangements, changing priorities for sourcing and supply, and the fact that at one point, I think our CEO was in one state and we had all the directors in other states, and I was in COVID lockdown as well, and the problems associated with trying to even coordinate that. So we've learned a lot. Defence has learned and companies have learned that they really need to think about their supply chains. So I think you're going to find that a lot of effort in terms of modern manufacturing initiative and other things will focus in on how do we get that supply chain resilience. And again, it's not about establishing it all in Australia, it's about how you get assurance. They're two different things. But also we're going to find that the US is going to do the same thing. We're going to see it, perhaps a lot more repatriation of the US supply chain back to the US. There will be that tendency. So we're going to see that over the next year or two. And then after that, I think the special relationship between the US, UK and Australia will probably mean that we'll be happy to do it within that group, but outside that group we'll have to have a think about how we manage that. So it is, I guess, fairly important there. The last one is one that I think resonates with what Mark was saying about the Navy. It's all about the people. Defence industry workforce is probably the greatest challenge ahead, not just for New South Wales industry, but for defence industry right across. It's the local military equipment spend over the past year, despite COVID lockdown, went up a third. So $3.5 billion was spent in Australia instead of 1/3 less than that the year before. Now that's an incredible amount. That's for the elephant to eat. You've got to actually. Defence industry had to find the people to do that. That meant everyone had to plus up in the right areas by 10 or 20% in people. There's another $3 billion increase in acquisition spending planned for this year. We're on our 9th straight year of real growth in defence. 44.6 billion this year. We're going to have 75 billion by the end of this decade. So think about it. Money is not the problem here, as in resources. People are the problem. And you go down to Canberra and think about the Canberra bubble. Well, if you're ex-military and want to do a little bit of consulting, then now is the time to be in Canberra. There is, defence needs a lot of people to drive these projects through, and there's an incredible demand, an insatiable demand for that defence experience down in Canberra. And what does it do? It drives up the price as well. So obviously less capability, less bang for your buck. So what do we need to do? We need to manage to get our defence industry to expand by 11% year on year for the next few years. If we don't do that, we're not going to deliver necessarily what defence wants. Think about Canada. Canada is 4 times our defence industry dollar value. And so there is nothing stopping Australia from aspiring in the defence industry to have 4 times what it has at the moment. So that gives you an indication. And Canada has the similar defence spend and a similar size population. So a couple of issues. We need to get on the radar screen of candidates to get into defence industry. We absolutely need to target that 1.7% and sort of and indicate that it isn't just 1.7%. This is a really exciting career. We're not a small pimple on the side of economic endeavours within Australia or New South Wales. We are actually a great place to work and something that absolutely is important for Australia. The second one is something that I resemble, and that is an ageing workforce. And regretfully, defence industry has an ageing workforce. And so the company that I work with, they're close to 50. Is the average age in a manufacturing area. Now that's, what we need to do is get young people involved in manufacturing, in defence industry going forward. And you can see on the slide there's a number of programs that are being operated by the Commonwealth Government, New South Wales Government, to end up with much better outcomes from a workforce point of view. I'll just mention one, and that is the Jobs Plus program. If you're a New South Wales company and you establish 30 new jobs, then there are a lot of monetary benefits. You get also support the training of those people, payroll tax exemptions, etc. So there's a lot of benefits that New South Wales is doing to try to cover some of that expansion and the cost of training up that new workforce. And I guess in the pictures there, you can see that STEM programs are a key part of getting the youth involved. On the right there in the orange light vest, that's a youth group out at Garden Island, and then on the left, it's part of the STEM shift in high schools, so year 11 and year 12, people being allowed to get involved in STEM type activities leading to defence industry. So in conclusion, I guess I hope that I've indicated to you that defence industry is not just a nice to have, it is now critical. We do not have the people in the Defence Force to cover the things that defence industry is relied on. It is now people in black polo shirts and other things that are now on the doing some of the operational level maintenance and almost all of the deeper maintenance. And we also need to think about how do we boost that workforce. That workforce will be our limiting factor going forward. We need to really think about getting young people into it. And everyone in this room, RUSI, as well as the military folks, as well as defence industry, have a role in putting forward the fact that defence industry is a great place to work, and it's a very, very satisfying and important job. It's innovative and obviously leads to great careers going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marshal Osley. We are now, Chris Jenkins, the Chief Executive Officer of TELUS Australia and New Zealand, will be presenting online. Chris phoned in this morning, he was feeling off, and in the current restrictions, if you're off, don't come in.
Industry works, and I guess some of the key principles that I use, and I think other members of industry use, to create sustainable defence capability and a capability that can be used, particularly in these times, to deliver that capability advantage that defence so importantly needs. The important things right now, you've heard, I believe, through the earlier discussions around the rapidly changing strategic environment and the need for the appropriate responses to that rapidly changing environment. Coupled with that is an incredibly high rate of acceleration in technology change. And as an engineer and someone in defence industry who's been observing this now for quite a long time, there has not been a rate of technology change and breakthrough in the history of the human race that we're seeing today. And that is a fact. No one has seen the advent of capability shifts and technology shifts occurring at the rate they are today. The advent of digitally enhanced defence capabilities, autonomous capabilities, artificial intelligence, the use of data analytics, cyber, and the like, autonomous capabilities and the ability to take man out of the loop, or man out of the harm's way, I should say, incredibly important aspects of how defence is going to be needing capability advantage delivered in the future. The agility with which defence industry needs to adapt to be able to deliver on those technology needs of defence is now critical. And as I say, it's an historic rate of change. So our ability to build relationships with all those that contribute to the knowledge around defence and the industrial capabilities needed, universities, research organisations, small, medium enterprises, large international primes, all of those people need to combine their strengths to adapt that incredible rate of change. And I'll talk a bit more about that because it's a fundamental principle. The second part is around these circumstances of strategic shift have actually created a disruption to the global supply chains that Australia's been used to. It's not the first time. It's the first time we've had a pandemic like this, at least first time in recent years, last 100 years. The pandemic has made it a global phenomenon. So everyone has really been affected by it. Everyone has significantly been impacted by it and is therefore paying attention. We've seen it before though. And when 9/11 occurred and those strategic shifts that occurred during that time frame, it was not possible for Australia to get some of the key defence capabilities it needed from partner countries around the world, because as that uncertainty, that moment came in, no one knew exactly how that was going to evolve. So they withheld strategically for their own national interests capabilities. So Australia has seen disruptions to the flow of defence capabilities before. So this current focus on resilience and having in-country capability is a critical thing for us to embrace and understand how to take forward in a sustainable way to make sure that when any future disruptions occur for whatever reason, either national conflicts, pandemics or whatever, that the country is better and stronger as a result of the pandemic. So those two key areas of technology rate of change and strategic circumstance and global disruption, that rate of change leads to, what does Australian industry need to be able to do to strengthen and provide greater resilience for the nation's needs. New South Wales is particularly well placed to be able to deliver on that. And I say that as a New South Welshman, but it's also important to recognise we have the largest percentage of skilled workforce across the country. We have the greatest percentage of universities and tertiary educated workforce coming through. And now that we're at a time when we're coming out of what I'd call a period of industrial atrophy, if you look at the early 2000s where industries and engineering and those sorts of things were not seen as the kind of glamour sectors for people to go into. In fact, from looking at it from a defence perspective, innovation, engineering activity on the ground in Australia was not a high priority at all. Innovation was often seen as risk, and buying direct from overseas was seen as the way to get most of the defence capability needs without risk. Now we recognise that there is risk in that. One, because it means that there'll be times during disruption you can't get the capabilities. And two, because the needs of Australia can be different to those of other nations around the world. So our ability to adapt capabilities to the specific needs of Australia's Defence Force is critical. So that change in circumstance places New South Wales in a very good position to encourage future careers in STEM, science, technology, engineering and maths, to encourage a generation of people that see industry and the generation of advanced technologies as a very viable and a very attractive career path. So I think New South Wales has a very strong ecosystem to encourage the kind of growth in skills needed for the future and the future needs that Australia's Defence Forces have. The other good news in this, as I said, there was a period of industrial atrophy in Australia, and there wasn't a high priority on doing things locally, innovating locally. Now there are policies in place. The 2016 white paper launched the concept of industry as a fundamental input to capability. The idea of defence and industry partnering on the rapid delivery of the capabilities that Australia needed. And the update to that strategic plan in 2020 generated a much more urgent message around how much more we need to grow the industrial capabilities in Australia, focus a higher level of local capabilities and building up of those local capabilities. So what does the part of a large prime like Thales Australia have in that? But I'd say that is true of all large primes and internationals working in Australia. But I think there's three really important principles to create a sustainable defence industry capability that can provide defence capability advantage specific to Australia's needs. The three of these: firstly, it's around innovation and knowledge. And the second is around industrial capabilities, facilities, people, skills. And the third is around being globally competitive to make sure that you're a cost-effective and efficient organisation. On the first one, innovation and knowledge. Australia is a small country relative in terms of population. To try and have all of the engineering knowledge, innovative knowledge in one organisation, one company, doesn't make any sense. It's hard. It's virtually impossible. I've been a strong believer for many years now in creating a network of knowledge. And international companies like my own and many others can have a great reach back to bring technologies from other countries into Australia. Big advantage for Australia because other countries have paid for that baseline technology. So full technology transfer, bring it in, and then combine our workforce with supply chain workforce in Australia to actually build up a very much larger capacity of innovation. All the engineering minds across Australia's supply chain can then be combined to create great outcomes, great outputs. We've been doing that for a wide range of technologies in Australia. We've been doing it with sonars, we've been doing it with rifles from Lithgow, we've been doing it with munitions down in Mulwale, we've been doing it for a variety of capabilities that we deliver to defence. But creating a knowledge network and an innovation network with small, medium enterprises, with tertiary organisations, great universities. We'll hear from Alex Zielinski from Newcastle shortly, Newcastle Uni, great universities in New South Wales, combining those skills, working with the Defence Science Technology Group, Defence Material Technology Centre. We combine a knowledge network that can then resolve the tricky capability problems that Defence has much more quickly and effectively. We can deliver agility to Australia's defence-specific needs through the course of that. Second part is the industrial capabilities. We need scale, and the larger companies like my own can bring scale to this, both financially, but also through the practical facilities and workforce we have. So in New South Wales alone, we've got nearly 2,000 people in Towers, but in our supply chain in New South Wales, we have around 1,200 people as well. So if you look at our total workforce effect from the work we do in New South Wales, around 3,200. Across Australia, we have about 4,000 people, and again, another 2,000 people in our supply chain. Accenture recently conducted a study of our supply chain activities. And if you look at all of the combined work across Australia, that very large component that comes from New South Wales basically is that indicator of what a well-positioned state New South Wales is to deliver on defence capability needs. So building up that industrial base with large organisations as hubs, but a very large supply chain providing innovative, cost-effective solutions, doing those things really well, then leads to the third outcome, which is about being globally competitive. By innovating and creating performance-differentiated products, capabilities, systems, solutions for defence, those performance-differentiated solutions find their way into the global market, can find their way into the global market, and to strategic partners of Australia, create a bridge and a connection between the countries. It's also a great demonstration for taxpayers who are looking for good value for money coming from the money spent within the local industrial base. It's an important thing because in previous times, one of the reasons for not doing things locally on the ground in Australia was it was considered to attract a very large premium, a cost premium. By being globally competitive, by increasing scale, by being cost effective in how we do our operations, that's a great demonstration, I think, to government and to taxpayers that work done in Australia is money well spent. So combining those three factors, knowledge network, innovation, scale in strategic capabilities, facilities and people, and combining those two to create globally competitive capabilities means that you end up with a sustainable defence capability that can then be there in an agile way to respond to defence's capability needs as they evolve. That builds the resilience, and I'm pleased to say that I'm seeing a much stronger embrace of that in the last 2 years than I've ever seen before in 40 years working in defence industry in Australia. The final point that I'd like to make is around how capabilities are now being procured and brought into being quickly. Because as I said before, rate of technology change, rate of strategic circumstance change is one of the biggest risks the country faces. So our ability to generate solutions is one thing. Our ability to work with defence as partners to generate the outcomes rapidly is an essential need. And what I have seen is when Australian troops are on high tempo operations, as they were in Afghanistan over the last years, we saw a very, very rapid approach to acquiring capabilities to support those troops on operations. Whether it was to do with the rifles we produce up in Lithgow, the munitions we provide to them, the vehicles that we produce, albeit in Victoria, some great vehicles like the Bushmaster, there was very, very collegiate, strong partnering in delivering capabilities quickly. Now that's in a high tempo environment. In low tempo environments, peacetime, things slow down and the process can become circular and sometimes elongated. And I think in the current circumstances Australia's in, there's a need for a higher tempo way of operating. I should say, during the operational times when Australia's troops were on operations, things were happening very quickly and delivery of capability occurred very quickly. But it's also been acknowledged in defence that there were no commercial shortcuts taken during that timeframe. It's just that everyone was pulling capability through with a level of urgency and I guess a common set of goals in mind. I think if we can establish those common goals, create those partnerships and links between end users and industry suppliers, there's a much stronger position for Australia to meet the capability delivery challenges that may be ahead, the agility, the speed and the assurance and resilience needed. So I'd just like to finish on that point, and I'll be very happy to take questions after at the appropriate time. But again, thanks to RUSI for organising today's conference. I truly appreciate it, and I am very sorry I couldn't be there with you today.
Ladies and gentlemen, earlier I talked about books that come across my desk in the RUSI library, and I came across the DSTO annual review, 2013-14, only last week, and there's a beautiful photo of a young Air Vice Marshal Kim Osley unveiling a model of the full-scale F-35A Joint Strike Fighter to investigate the effects of electromagnetic interference on the aircraft developed by DSTO in 2014. Very much younger looking Air Vice Marshal. And then in the inset, of course, is a photograph and a report by the Chief Defence Scientist, then Dr. Alex Sazinski, who became head of DSTO and now is the Vice Chancellor of Newcastle University. And it's really important now that we understand the important role that the higher education organisation across Australia plays is part of this partnership in building with defence and defence industry the capability of the Australian Defence Force requires. Alex?
Thanks for the introduction, and I should also begin by thanking Professor Michael Howard, this company heading up RUSI New South Wales. Michael and I go back a long way. He actually gave me my first job in academia back in 1984. I was a lecturer at the University of Illinois. So yes, it's many years have passed now. Pass again, Michael. But, great to be here. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land which we meet upon, the Aurora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's been a terrific program. I really enjoyed hearing from the commanders and certainly the Fleet Commander, the Forces Commander and the Air Commander. So nice to see you guys, and also the very good context around the resilience. And Kim Osley, certainly New South Wales Defence Advocate, I think Kim, you really did some really good points there, and also things from Chris Jenkins as well. So while we've got capability, we've got resilient capability, people thinking about the here and now, but you've got to fast forward further. I think Mark, you touched on high-tech platforms, and I think that's what this whole capability is. It's about more and more high-tech, and how do you get access to high-tech. And some of the high-tech, I think as Chris Jenkins talked about, let's just buy it off the shelf. That was just procure it. But clearly you can't necessarily procure things unless you actually can add something and bring something to the table, or be able to exchange capability. And even that nuclear submarine capability deal is actually premised on the fact that Australia will contribute technology in exchange for getting access to other technologies. So I think that's part of the game. If you want to be in the high-tech space, you've got to play in the highest-tech space and be a smart buyer, but you've got to be a smart user and a smart innovator in the space. So let me see if I can move through the presentation here. And I think everyone's talked a little bit about the ecosystems. I was certainly involved in the early days, 2016 defence white paper. It feels like a long time ago. I thought that was probably one of the best white papers that had been out since probably the 2000 white paper or thereabouts. I think it was 2001 at the time. And the others were sort of just installments, but this one was a real game-changing one. It really said we're going to step up and we're going to embrace innovation. And I think the next strategy, which is the 2030, which is subsequently just come out as an update, I think continues on in that same rate. It's not a U-turn, it's really heading in the same direction. And the other important point that came out of that is the partnerships, be it with industry and be it with universities. And certainly when I was in the white paper, we had certainly a lot to contribute and to listen to, and I think that was wonderful that we were able to be at the table and able to influence the policies and settings. And and we were able to think about how to start to draw on all the capability. Traditionally, my predecessors used to do in the role of Chief Defence Scientist, a bit like the guys in uniform. We wanted more people, more capability, and it became very clear to us that it was going to be capped for various reasons, not just with budget reasons, but also just capacity reasons. We just could not recruit the people that we wanted. And it's increasing what's also happened in the last 30, 40 years. Australia's whole education scene has changed. Universities, research agencies like CSIRO, etc., have become more and more capable and have got more capability. So the pie has grown, and there are more researchers out there doing more innovation, doing more interesting things. And with 2,000 defence scientists, that sounds like a lot of people, actually they can't cover all the space because technology is continually growing and complexity increases and more capabilities evolve. So it's really becoming to understanding what you can specialise in and what you can try to get others in. And so the idea was always to see how we can get Team Australia coming together to work on the challenging capabilities. And so it's really is the ecosystem, and Chris did talk about it. You know, you've got the industry and the community engagement. We heard from our colleagues from the forces commanders, and really then led by industry doing its own research and innovation, where it's thinking of how to add that next bit of capability. But then underpinning that, you do need an educated workforce. And I think that was you touched upon that about a nuclear commander. I think it's a master's degree there. They don't need PhDs. You need to work at the university, but to command a nuclear submarine, you do need a master's. But even that is quite an advanced form of studies. A lot of the crew are actually nuclear trained. At least half the crew in the US. So that will mean that we'll need universities doing that. Now, should we all the universities start running nuclear science courses? The answer is no. We've got things like that. We've got ANSTO, which is a great organisation already with some capabilities. The ANU, I know, had some capabilities, and UNSW, for example, plays with ANSTO. They've had some good arrangements going back many years. I think Wollongong University has a bit more nuclear medicine, but these are the universities that have actually got some capability. Those are the ones we should be backing in to further develop. I'll be against establishing more programs in it just because people want them. And Kim and I talked earlier on about some people down south wanting to do some hypersonics work, and I'm saying why? Because the best capabilities is in Queensland around DST up there and UQ. But that's the important point, is getting the concentrations. And so through this, through a combination of research and innovation, education, working with industry and the community, you can build the resilience across defence. And so that will uplift capability, and as well as develop technologies for the future. And so I had the privilege of working in DST. It was a wonderful organisation to work in. I was in there for 7 or 8 years, learned a lot, and like all good things, time to do something else. And I actually feel that where I am now, I can actually do the next phase of the innovation of supplying workforce into defence, both the industry and into the ADF, but also to think about how we can actually help industry get going, particularly out there in Williamtown. Let me move on. One of the things that, I'll talk a little bit about the Defence White Paper from 2016. I think we talked about, you can quote Christopher Pine and his biography he wrote about, quite some interesting stories there. I was once I started seeing he was mentioning names, I was a bit worried he might mention me. Then I was disappointed he didn't mention me at all. But one of the things he did talk about was the Defence White Paper innovation space. Essentially, Defence for the first time was willing to risk $1.6 billion without actually getting a return on. Every program in Defence would fight for the dollars to say it's X billion for this, and you have to spend it and not overspend and try not to do anything wrong with the money and make sure the capability comes in. But here we're actually going to say, we believe that we can spend this money and it may actually return an innovation or a success, or it may not. But that was part of the argument I had when I said to the Secretary and the Minister and the Chief Defence Force at the time, well, I don't know which part of this 1.6 is going to give you a return, but if we do it well, we're going to place the bets and we don't know which ones, and that's what will happen. I learned that when I worked at CSIRO. We backed at the time, which was a guy, CEO called John Stocker, great guy, said let's do some forward thing, and he backed 10 projects. One of the projects he backed was Wi-Fi, and that was the last one to get up. Everyone said, what? Wireless to computers? Who would ever want that? And it went on to be one of the greatest innovations produced out of Australia for the IT industry. And all wireless that runs today is underpinned by that technology. We didn't know at the time that was going to be the winner or a $1 billion program generating, but that's how innovation works. You've got to back a portfolio of projects, and at the time it comes. And that's what I think was one of the great things about the Defence White Paper 2016 is we actually backed a portfolio of winners and we're willing to put money at risk. The other important point was there was a variety of research engagement projects. There's no single way to do innovation. It's not like every problem is a nail and you've got a hammer and you just say we're going to do just contract research with industry. Actually doing work which is sometimes based on things like, we've got a lot of small businesses and we copied the US program called the Early Stage Research Program, or ESPER. We also set up networks and also set up challenges. So in other words, you've got to actually say, can you build a machine that can fly past the speed, hypersonic speeds? And that's a challenge, it's a grand challenge, and maybe turn that into something else. So we had those type of projects. As well as also cooperative research centres, which are actually being very successful in the Australian industry, where you've got industry working with the end users, working with universities and government organisations like CSIRO, DST, working on problems and solving. So we were using a variety of those. And but the other big point is we decided after surveying for 2030 what technologies we need. And there's 9 little boxes or diamonds along there, and it's space capabilities, quantum technologies, trusted autonomous systems, cyber. 5 years on, good bets. Don't know which ones of those is exactly going to come out a winner, but that's what we decided that we should concentrate on and use collaborative mechanisms to work with industry and universities to advance Australia's capabilities in those areas. And in those areas we've done reasonably well. Not everything is going super well, but it's interesting when I heard about us, so I was very pleased to hear that we're setting up the space division. At the time when I was in defence, we launched a satellite, a very small one. It was for the jaw and radar to see whether we could do the ionosphere calibration for jaw. And that was the first satellite Australia had launched since FedSat, 20 years. And now we've got a space capability. So in those little experiments you do, show you've got the capability, show the need, and then things move on. And I think this is the value in an R&D program and the innovation program. And interestingly, the 2030 it's moved on, and it's actually moved closer to building off that strategy. I was just looking at it the other day. It's about more together, but that's what it's saying is get players, defence working with industry, working with universities, you get more. But it only comes because you work together, because you're drawing on capabilities, and it's one of those 1 + 1 = 3 results. And the same thing is the DST has actually got its focus on what they call them. I call them grand challenges. When you put a new paper up, they're called something else now. They're called the moonshot, starshots. But it's trying to show the scale of the capability to go for other effects. And I think all these things are building off what we had earlier, and again, trying to make some distinctive bets. One of the things we did set up, and I think this is one of the successful things, was to look at developing everyone knows that precincts and industrial clusters work, and that's been shown time and again, and we've seen that it's happening in places like South Australia, certainly in shipbuilding, etc. Good success there. But there's other things we started to do. We studied in Victoria, it's called the Defence Science Institute, which basically got the universities in Victoria to work together on very small defence problems, but they started to build capability which was relevant, or they started to understand how defence needs are expressed, and they could actually start to bid for projects, etc. And out of that, that led to the Defence Innovation Network here in New South Wales. Same thing, all the New South Wales universities coming together, sharing relevant capability. They read the defence strategic plans, the white papers, and then try to align that and propose projects around that. And slowly we're building more capability. South Australia's done the same thing. I didn't update this slide. I know that West Australia's already got one, a similar network in place, and I think that Queensland has, but they will in the end. State government money, university money, plus a little bit of defence money. So everybody's putting in $1 and getting $2 of leverage, so everybody's a winner. But yet the program is actually orientated towards defence outcomes. Over the horizon, longer ones, but you're starting to get researchers interested in. And people who do good work can then be recruited in. One of the ones that we set up really early was with the Army, which is around Human Performance Research Network, which is really about saying it's more about the physical force, and then you've got the ability to work as teams, and that was a very interesting research network. But when we studied the sector when I was working, I found that there was no single university that had the capability, and every one of them would come and bid to us about, can we do something for you quite separately? In the end, we actually said, who are the best people in Australia, and put them together into a network, and funded the network. And so the other networks, you can see they were state-based because of state government money, but here we wanted one which is national, because Army doesn't just live in one state, and you need to get the capabilities for them from the rest. So these ideas of having networks, partnerships, collaborations directed to a certain futuristic problem is where we need to be positioned. The other one we set up, and I think this is going to be a great program for the longer term, is the Defence CRC for Trusted Autonomous Systems. So basically, these are systems where they work on their own, but they have to. How do you know an autonomous system will do what it's supposed to do, and it's not hacked and turned against you, or it fails to do its mission properly, or it's supposed to work in a predictable way? And how do you guarantee that? And also at the same time can be properly integrated into the chain of command. So it'll do just as a good warfighter would do, exactly what they're told to do, when, under what circumstances. So these are the systems we need. So this doesn't exist at the moment. And this is part of the futuristic program. Very much working closely with defence. Is it? It seems like a bit odd colours there. That's kind of different to what I had. No? Okay. So yes, and really brought in a whole bunch of universities, etc. And one of the things we were working on was that little glider there, because it actually came out of a little SME in Sydney. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. I was just thinking of racking my brains. But if you ever seen the movie of the Titanic filming, and then reclaiming was that in the movie James Cameron, who goes down there. The guy who built that machine for him was an Australian engineer out of Sydney. Really understood how to make high pressure vehicles, and vehicles work under high pressure and go very, very deep. So he's actually been worked with Defence to create a glider that could go down to several thousand metres of water depth. I won't tell you how far it can go, it's not supposed to, but that is a game-changing technology. And of course, when things are operating at that depth, they have to be autonomous and work exactly how you want. But a glider like that has got all, and because it can actually move in a sinusoidal pattern, can keep generating enough energy to keep going for almost an infinite distance. So it could change the whole way you do surveillance, etc. So this is a technology, Australian technology, which is better than anyone else has got. And this is because we've got that niche capability. We've got great universities, City University has been working with them, and DST here in Sydney. And put it together, put it into a CRC, get the Navy sponsoring it, wanting it, giving the kind of requirements that it needs out of such a system, then you can create a game-changing capability. Then when you're talking to your Five Eyes colleagues, you've got something to talk to them about. Another one which is like that, which is we've been a world leader in for a long time, has been Hypersonic Technology. And that's up in really centred out of Queensland. We started that work. In the end, the US got right behind it, including NASA and AFRL, and there's now a dedicated facility in Queensland. It's been built to do this work and to take it to new classified levels. And I'm very pleased with this program. It was a program we backed in nearly 10 years ago, and I think it's going to deliver, again, game-changing capabilities that I think Australia can. And if you read in the media what the Russians, the Chinese are doing, we need this stuff. And Australia's got its own capabilities. I'm now a hunter, so there's a lot going on there, and I actually think that RUSI should be up there. We welcome you guys to have some meetings up there and visit us and have a look at what's happening in regional Australia. I think you'd probably say for now down in the Shoalhaven, they've got some great capability there as well. So, but this is, and there are now activation zones, and there's, Kim talked very well about that and the type of the opportunities around the workforce and the potential there. And we see there's a lot of potential there to support with the capabilities that are there, but also industry, but also the workforce. And we're excited. So we've actually built a little small campus out there, and we're working in that space. So it'll be around sustainment initially, but we certainly think it could be further developed into autonomous systems and other related work. Future opportunities, if I navel gaze, one of the things that we've all seen, Australia has to agree to be carbon neutral by 2050, and I suppose that those requirements will filter through the whole system, including the ADF. And you can't have an electric boat. You might have some parts of it, but at the end of the day, you can have a lot of diesel being used, and in the Air Force as well. So, but hydrogen is now emerging as the alternative kind of green fuel that could actually go places and go significant distances. And Australia is well positioned, and including the Hunter Valley is one of the elements. So we think Australia can develop world-leading capabilities around hydrogen, which will be a future fuel. We're not talking about next 5-10 years, you're talking the 20-30 year time frame. But you've got to be thinking about that now to start thinking about how to position. Cyber, it's not going away. It's, if anything, it's even more important than it was even 5 years ago when we were working on that first white paper. I think human factors, we heard the talks from the commanders about how they rely on people and how do you make teams operate better and more effectively, and also how they will interact with technology. Because that's more and more, and if you can close that loop and make that integration faster, more natural, more error-free, you will have capability of knowledge. Big data are just swamped. All these systems are just full of data. And how do you actually manage that data and be able to look at those nuggets about where is there a problem that hasn't even emerged, but the data may actually have signs. It's about time this component may fail in a little while because it's correlated to performance other elements in the system. And climate adaptation is going to be a key challenge. I'm not talking about, we talked about more natural disasters, and those disasters are correlated back to climate change. So how would the ADF adapt to that and operate? And we still think that advanced materials, just materials continually advancing there, could change the camouflage of a ship by being able to alter its properties. So there's so much more to do that. Again, an X-factor type of capability through investment from new things. So I just think that these areas, and Australia's got, not my university, the whole Australian university system, including organisations like CSIRO, can contribute into these areas and give Australia a competitive edge. And finish up there, that's actually a photo of squadron leader Chris Baker, up there 45, and his wife works for him, so she got me this photo, and he's based up at Williamtown. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you, Alex. We're going now to have a second question time. Now, before I ask the first question, after afternoon tea, I think we will have a little bit of time for questions from the floor. So I would ask you to think about formulating those questions before we, so that we can articulate those questions when we finish this. Okay, how can we maximise the contributions of the New South Wales-based industry to assist the Australian Defence Force improve its capabilities, especially those capabilities that assist building resilience? Would anybody like to start that? Alex? Okay.
I'll kick it off, but I think as far as maximising the contributions, then you probably need to first of all think about how you prepare industry for it. So how do you actually get the skill set and also arrange so that the capabilities of the companies are being developed at exactly the right time to respond to the requirements of defence, to respond in a time frame which is appropriate for the contracting and the way that projects are actually issued out of defence, and where they have their workforce trained up to actually deliver the capability. And so you might think that's an easy thing to do, but if I use the example of the F-35, it's not. Because if we actually decided back in 2006 which companies could support the F-35 program, where we've now got, we're on track for $4 to $6 billion in industry outcomes for Australia, there was almost no companies back in 2006 that could respond. They didn't have the right partnerships. They didn't have skill sets. One of the most successful companies is actually a Victorian company, RAN, that responded and is building vertical tails for the F-35. They're building like 750 of the things. Absolutely incredible. And they were making car parts, production line parts for Holden and Ford at the time. They had not really got into aerospace. They were doing some mining. So they needed to go up a very steep learning curve and then be prepared to respond to the tenders and do it. I think the same for New South Wales industry, and that is that we've got a lot of companies that are already doing great business. The ones that aren't necessarily in that game at the moment, they need to be assisted by developing them first, lining them up. They need to have a dating service. They need to be connected to the right people and be prepared in the right time frame. So I think it's probably it's a temporal problem, lining this up, as well as actually the capability issue as well.
So I'll just introduce myself first. So Peter Ball, I'm the Vice President of Digital Systems for CALIS, so ex-Australian Air Force, a lifetime ago. About 23 years in industry, all around C4I, mainly in defence, but recently also looking after the civilian equivalent. So I do think this with rail as well. I think rail is a really good example of where, we're talking about the defence thing, but where industry probably wasn't engaged enough, and universities probably wasn't engaged enough in New South Wales. New South Wales invested billions of dollars into rail infrastructure, so new metro lines here and all that sort of stuff. We don't have the resources in country to support that rail rollout. So we don't have the engineering skills, we don't have the signal skills, we don't have the capability. So what happens in industry is we just get compressed and we get companies not delivering on time, they're behind schedule, or we're trying to get resources in from overseas. Great, pre-COVID, not so great during COVID. So trying to get there. So what happens in country then is we just keep stealing resources from each other. So industry don't have enough, so prices go up, or we take them from interstate, and strangely enough, Victoria are also investing heavily in rail in that instance. So I think, following on from Kim's point, we've really all got to be aligned on what's going to happen and what's coming down the line from a defence point of view. So we know submarines, we know F-35s. So we as an industry can be prepared. Universities can be prepared to train our students, and then us from an industry point of view can be ready to start delivering that capability when it's required, or bring people in from overseas when that's required as well.
Thank you very much. Well, firstly, I want to say there is a STEM crisis in Australia in terms of the workforce. Even in my own discipline, engineering, 2019, Australia advertised 28,500 jobs in the area, and 11,000 of those jobs were filled by graduates of Australian universities. That is the maximum we produce. So we were importing 18,000 engineering jobs. Now, in the last 2 years, no one's coming here. People are, robbing Peter to pay Paul to get the capability. And the other interesting thing is that the way the federal government is funding universities, there is no incentive to educate any more. We can't afford it. Programs are too expensive for the numbers of students we have. We can barely run them. You cannot afford to expand them. So we've got a skills shortage, not generating enough people, so that will actually, I think, ultimately impact on the ADF and industries that serve the ADF. So I think that's the first thing, is to get that message across. We've got to understand. And it's not about, I think, the government having to throw doors open to every course in every university. It's just saying these courses are important and then choosing to fund the bits that make sense. The other bit I wanted to say is the Defence Innovation Networks, or the networks that were set up. I think they should be leveraged more encouragement from the Defence Force itself to say, here's good problems, or to keep feeding them to make sure that they continue aligned and producing capability, or people interested in producing capability, and then will sponsor students. The other bit is Australian universities are now starting to work more and more closely with industry. That's the way they are, and industry is coming there. But defence needs to be there to encourage industry to work with Australian universities. They sometimes will very easily quickly procure something. If you're a multinational, bring it in from overseas if necessary, but that doesn't necessarily build national capability. So defence has got to take the long view, say, they don't have to be in the middle of the thing, just saying you and you should work together, and taking that strategic view and maybe offering encouragement there. The other bit is, I think, for defence, I learned that one of the things is that it's a great invest in people and training. You're continually training people, and including members of your family, etc., and they all move around. So I think one of the things that the Australian universities, or New South Wales universities, should be doing is supporting lifelong learning at a distance, or flexible programs that allow people to keep up their skills or acquire new skills. And we notice that people come to Wellington for 2 years, but it usually takes 3 years to complete a program or do something. So, and they might not embark on it in the first place. So we've got to find flexible ways to build capability, or support lifelong learning. And the other bit I think is really important now is to support secondments between various people. When I know you guys put a uniform on to leave and then come back is very hard. I've moved around a bit, but one of the big things I've now got about 3 or 4 super schemes which are all fragmented, and how to integrate that. Now I'm not worried about them getting to the back end of my career and thinking, what was I thinking when I kept changing my job? But the point is, we need to actually have that flexibility and allow people to go out, be seconded, pick up some new skills and come back. One of the guys I did, I'm really pleased with, was when I worked in Defence, he was my deputy at the time, Todd Mansell. Todd went out after I left, and I supported it. The secretary sent him off to the Boeing. He was working to the CTO of Boeing Global, and for 2 years. Now he's back and he's in charge of the nuclear submarine program. Right guy, he's the guy to do it. He's picked up a hell of a lot from being with Boeing Global, working to their CTO. Difference maybe technology set, but I think that the principles that you learn around leadership, and we need more of that. And we need more people to be moving between universities and industry and defence. The whole thing has to be moving around, and not have employment barriers like superannuation block you from moving around. So thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question, how can we maximise the ability of New South Wales-based universities to assist the ADF improve its capabilities, especially those capabilities that assist in building resilience? So that's the first page, right? The next question, can major overseas-owned defence companies and or universities rely on overseas financial funding provide support to Australian Defence Force capability requirements and still remain independent of political pressures.
Yeah. Probably I'll just offer a comment and then obviously throw to my enthusiastic sidekicks here that I want to elaborate on that. So I think the issue there is about do we have a secure supply chain and do we have enough control over the intellectual property if we go to, if we take overseas companies providing that and rely on that. And I think, you know, if we go back through history, it's only perhaps a very small footnote in history, but the Carl Gustav rifle, revolverless rifle back in Vietnam was sort of came up as an issue at one point where they sort of said, well, Sweden had a, who had made the Carl Gustav rifle, said that they didn't want their equipment to be used in various conflicts. Now you wonder why they would make a revolverless rifle. They didn't particularly want it used in conflicts, but anyway. Ultimately they did allow Australian forces to use it in Vietnam, but it was a discussion item at the time. But it does, what it does indicate is that you do need to have enough control over your supply chain and enough control over your intellectual property where you do not feel constrained. I know there's no one on the front row here that won't agree with the following, and that is that if the US decided they didn't want us to particularly be involved in a conflict, then most of our platforms that are US origin will grind to a halt in pretty quick order. And that is because there is no way that you can support something where the global supply chain goes back to the US without obviously their tacit agreement. We have a very special relationship with the US, and so we take that as a strategic reality, not even a risk. It's a reality, and you just acknowledge that. To get around that, though, in terms of any reduction in priority in that supply chain, we always think about that supply chain. And if I take the F-35 as an example, yes, we have a global supply chain for the F-35 and our parts coming from around the world. But we also have many parts in Australia, and we have the ability to operate for short periods of time on our own to cover those sort of issues. Going forward, though, I think we have a renewed interest in having a supply chain that is very secure, and so I think we will be quite particular about if we do end up relying on overseas OEMs for either IP or supply chain, we're going to want to see evidence of assurance of that supply chain, how we will assure it, and that could mean a mixture of stockpiling, Australian companies getting involved, etc. And with the IP, I think we're also going to see a lot more transfer of IP to Australia and demanding a lot more involvement in that going forward.
Yeah, well, Chris didn't want to show up, didn't want this question. Look, every modern democracy has a right to set their own rules of what they want and where they want to go. You know, under Trump, buy US, make in US. So, you know, a number of our industries in Australia have suffered because of that. Defence, maybe not, but I agree completely that, you know, the US, if they didn't want us to do something, we wouldn't be doing it for a long way. Now, obviously, I work for a French company, so I have a different spin on it a little bit, but I think from our point of view, it's about, as Chris said earlier, it's about transfer of technology into country. And the Australian customer, you guys, demanding of us IP. If you need to protect it, there's no point segregating half the world and saying we don't want to take stuff from there, demand IP. Okay, and if you don't demand IP, then you can't protect yourself in the future, and I think that's the most sensible way to go. I was surprised when we purchased the submarine. I was living in France at that stage when we purchased the submarine. We didn't buy the submarine, but we went down the pathway. The French were prepared to share. I never thought they would be, to be crystal clear. Now, whether they were or not, different story. But we as a country, I'm Australian through and through, we as a country need to demand IP and capabilities and store it locally and use maybe that entity, like in the example of the Thales, use the Thales entity to do the work in country or another partner to do the work in country and build the sovereign capability around that. Okay? Because I think once you get that, then you value add into that, and then we can support our other Five Eyes partners as part of that as well. My role in France, I spent 4 years in France, my role in France was looking after Thales Five Eyes community. So things that we're doing in the UK or in Australia or in the US, I was selling or sharing with the other Five Eyes entities within a French organisation. So, and that went quite sensibly. We're owned partly by the French government. They have a nice little golden share. Well, BAE, UK has a golden share in BAE, so it's no difference really.
Right. Do you mind if I just one small add-on comment there, and then I'll pass to Alex. And that is, maybe for some people in the room, there's also, in addition to sort of the technology and the intellectual property and the supply chain, there's a further thing, and that is intelligence mission data, and that is that most people in this room have got an iPhone. So no one really cares how you make an iPhone. They're like a commodity, and they make a gazillion of them. What really counts is the apps that are on that iPhone. And so Defence is really interested in understanding their apps. And so, how the intelligence mission data represents things to the air, land and maritime folk, the warfighters. And so one thing that I will say is that we can discuss how IP and how the technology and how the supply chain works, but one thing that you must have control over is your intelligence mission data and the way that it presents the information to the warfighters. We must have an understanding of that, because think about it, future war, we're responding faster than a human can get involved in the loop in some cases almost, and so if you can't trust the response of your weapon systems, then you really have no control.
Thanks, Kim. So, where do I start? So, I think it's all about the sovereign capability that we just talked a little bit about. And does the sovereign capability have to be fully Australian? No, not necessarily. Because we did in 2013 create the Defence Export Controls Act, which governs the way intellectual property moves in and out of Australia and what can go. So the people investing in Australia are bound by that, and as are all Australian citizens. So what that means is we've got a means by which it does allow people to invest, industry to invest, could be foreign companies, but as long as they are governed by that law. The other thing is that I don't think until recently Australian universities have been really regarded as sovereign capability. They're just regarded as places people can get educated, they do some research, but it's actually become very clear that overseas players have looked. There's always been foreign influence in every country tries to influence, but foreign interference is something else. And we've had foreign interference, particularly into our sovereign capabilities, such as our universities. They are an asset, and they can produce intellectual property, which is useful. And people who have no real idea, someone's come along and offered them some bit of work, etc., and off they go to do the work without really realising, asking the questions what's behind that. I want to reassure you that certainly 2019, 2020, the foreign interference guidelines have been passed and adopted, which is quite clear. So it's really about declaring your potential conflicts of interest. Where do you get your money from? Who's funded you? And asking questions on an annual basis is actually just shedding light on relationships. And that's now required in all Australian universities for every staff member to make a declaration annually. More so, it's really interesting, but we don't do that of people working in state governments, local governments, many other places where you think, well, what could happen there? Or even say media or communications companies, or there's so many other sovereign capabilities we have, and we really aren't really thinking about that. So I'm glad we're thinking about it in the university space, and I think because there was some foreign interference occurring, but overall I think it's now moved through, we're very clear, and we make sure that the people who we put forward to cooperate with defence haven't got any strange entitlements or kind of complications to their arrangements. But I think increasingly for Australia though to really benefit, it'll be important that our universities collaborate with other universities in like-minded countries like the Five Eyes. And DARPA is already funding research in Australian universities and has been doing it for a long time. So I think there's a lot of capability. I think we've actually got ourselves sorted better than other countries have in this regard. So Australia is one of the first to get the right defence export controls, did it right, and it also allows IP to be brought into Australia from abroad. So, and now we've got the ability to actually declare who's working with whom and having transparency. I think that actually gives governments certainty and clarity about who can work with whom. And then of course by publishing your priorities, publishing what you want to work in, establishing these networks, we're actually well set up. And so the key is to really be able to draw on the whole capabilities of Australia, all of the capabilities, be it industry, be it academia, be it the community, to support Australia, to support the ADF.
Thank you, Alex. The last question I've got on the slide is how can the RUSI New South Wales assist in supporting New South Wales-based defence industry and New South Wales-based universities in fulfilling their future growth aspirations?
Very happy. Just a real quick comment. I think I spoke about it during my presentation. That is that we need to be advocates for getting a more diverse age, sex, everything in terms of gender, rather, in terms of the workforce within defence industry, and also that could be that RUSI needs to think about how could they promote, I guess, recognise great achievements by young achievers within defence industry, and I think that would go a long way. It's about the one team idea. It's instead of just focusing on the predominantly on the uniform folk, it's about recognising that there's 40,000 or more people behind our defence force that are doing great work, many of them just down the road, and making sure that we recognise those people. So broadening the concept of what defence really is, and I think I'm already seeing that is happening, and I think RUSI would be amongst a majority of organisations now that are recognising defence industry in that way.
Look, there's thousands of years of military experience just in this room, so let alone in your 500 odd members in New South Wales. How does defence industry leverage that, maybe through coaching or mentoring some of our more junior staff who certainly don't come from the ADF? I think TALIS employs probably 80% of our workforce is non-ADF, not ex-serving ADF, so how do they get a better understanding of that? So can RUSI play a role in that? Is that something RUSI is interested in doing? I think it's something industry is always useful in knowing. So.
Thanks, Kim. It's on the technology, the on-off switch. Okay, so New South Wales, I think it's, I've lived here all my life, but I think if I ever summed up the New South Wales attitude of the government, they never fail to miss an opportunity, and in terms of new opportunities around industry. The reason I say this, I was in a meeting with the former Premier, so I can talk about this, so I'm not bagging anyone now from the immediate past, but and I had said that it was a real opportunity to get a submarine base on the East Coast in New South Wales, and she didn't register, and I tried a couple of times and moved on, and that's sometimes that mindset. It's not there. So Kim, your attitude, it's got to be that, because this time, if we do have nuclear submarines, the distance is not a problem. You could put a base in Tasmania, but I'm sure the people in Hobart will be arguing for the base to be located there. But the point is, it's really important to be proactive about the capabilities that needs to be done. Now, New South Wales, to be true, has now finally got a thing called Invest New South Wales, so decisions are starting to be more strategic, but nevertheless very slow, and not what other states, the Victorians, Queensland, South Australia, have absolutely outperformed. So I think we've got to be RUSI, New South Wales, is to remind the New South Wales government that it's a competition between states, and military capabilities won't be necessarily housed here because of some competitive advantage. That could be part of it, but it's not. There's also the state governments really get in there, and we saw that in the Defence White Paper. Things went to Queensland, went to Victoria and South Australia because they were bidding for them and were much more active than New South Wales. So I've got to say that I'm sort of I get frustrated by the fact that we've got that, and certainly in the Hunter, a lot of opportunity there. So I think we've got to be looking outside of Sydney, and sometimes I used to say to the Premier of Sydney, or Lord Mayor of Sydney, not actually Premier of New South Wales. What about the other capabilities, be it in the Illawarra, Shoalhaven, Hunter? Great, these are areas like Wollongong and Newcastle, the 7th and 8th largest cities in Australia, but you wouldn't know it. And we've got to be thinking about what capabilities they can, and they've got fantastic industrial bases coming out of mining and steel industry, exactly the sort of stuff that could actually power defence. And we've got to be thinking that way, and we need advocacy like RUSI.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Okay, Ken Broadhead, and then David Deasy.
Thank you. I think the Vice-Chancellor touched on this question, but I'm not sure if it's an elephant in the room or just an occasional irritant, but I wondered how you reconcile sensible and well-considered proposals by defence industry and by universities with political aspirations and local and state and federal timetables for elections, and also for media confusion and media bias.
Is that a comment or a question? But look, I think it says probably there's an element of, it's a complicated world we live in. We've got state government, federal governments, and you do need to try to line up the planets. And certainly, in my own area where I live now, there's a thing called Committee of the Hunter. All the industry, all the players that are there, and they're trying to sing off the same hymn sheet. And just recently, we actually were the first probably jurisdiction to publish a roadmap for hydrogen, saying what's the industry pathways for hydrogen to go for the next 20 years. And we were able to push that to state government, federal government. And 2 weeks ago, Scott Morrison turned up to make some announcements about hydrogen, and that Newcastle is one of the hubs, one of 7 around Australia, but at least we're there with one of 7. There'll be more competition, down selection, down to, I'm sure there'll be fewer in the long term, but you've got to have a strategy, and I think it's got to be locally led and engaging with the key stakeholders. So, and the same with for the Williamtown precinct. We're working with the ADF with the Air Force to think about how can we do things, how can we bring things there, but it's challenging. The New South Wales government declared Williamtown to be a special precinct and has given us $0. It's just a label. And they've got 43 special precincts across the state. So they haven't chosen anything really. And we've got to remind them, that's the role of the public and organisations like your own, to be pointing out the hypocrisy or the inconsistency.
Always good to follow you, Alex. Thank you very much. So it's the New South Wales Government representative here. So again, I think the issue you raise is a very good one, and that is why isn't the political media rhetoric matching the sort of the success that we expect out of New South Wales when it comes to defence industry? I think they're just two different things, and that is with New South Wales has done we are 50% of the defence industry, more than 50% of the defence industry in Australia, and we're achieving great outcomes and all the rest of it. But we're also 1.7% of the industry base, and so we're not the most exciting thing to be announced every day, and the Premier and others have other things that they want to announce. But it doesn't take away from the fact that we are achieving great outcomes. And I was listening the other day on a call where, in particular, Shoalhaven was congratulated on the support they're providing to naval aviation down there, and it's brilliant. They've got a great precinct and all the rest of it, and they're getting good support out of New South Wales government in skilling and things like that down there. But the industries themselves are doing the hard yards, and I think you saw up at Williamtown that it is becoming that centre of gravity, and it's providing great support up there and will provide great support going forward. Alex's comment about, should the New South Wales government be putting more and more money into it, I think it comes down to where else, what are the other priorities they have at that time and all the rest of it. Is it the highest priority going forward? And I think it isn't, that obviously is not always going to be the case. But I must admit that New South Wales defence industry is a great news story, but it certainly is not one that is coming across in the rhetoric and in the media and in the public announcements as much as other states, because in other states probably defence industry is a much greater percentage of their industry base, and also where they're seeing their growth. It's a fantastic opportunity.
Last question, David.
We've talked about sovereign capability in terms of missile construction. It's my understanding, and people can correct me, that the bulk of computer chips in the world are made either in Taiwan or South Korea, which appear to be, at the present time, the two most likely targets to be taken out in the first stage of any future conflict. Has any thought been given to Australia at least developing a boutique computer chip industry to give us some sort of sovereign capability?
That question's been raised for the Erytropolis as one of the potential capabilities for advanced manufacturing research facility. I should just say before I answer that, I've got to give Kim a bit of an apology there. It's been hard on the New South Wales government. But look, I think I'm just holding them to
The Premier wants to talk to me.
Yeah, it is a show. But I mean, look, to give you credit, it's better than it was, but it could be better. That's what I was saying. So, but semiconductors, it's a bit like getting into building fighter planes. It's such a big investment, and the capabilities that run deep. It's a 20, 30-year investment. I think going boutique. I think what you do is you need to guarantee supply chains, and the US has got capability. The Japanese have got capability. So do the Europeans. And I think we need to. I think it's much more important for us to get the design capabilities right and be able to design chips that actually do things. We can make things, but it would be very, very expensive because it's a commodity scale industry where you have to make millions of chips to get the right price. But we do need to have people who understand chip technology and be able to actually work on the next generation of design. That's it. But it's a good question. It's been looked at, but I think it has to be very, very boutique. The only thing that might be where we may get some advantages is some of the electronics at the low end is becoming more simplified. So, for example, you don't need to make solar cells no longer in silicon. You can literally print them on plastic with inks, and that could actually be something we could develop capability in and may have more resilience in.
No, nothing more to add there.
Yeah. Probably the only thing from my point of view would be that what we need to be more mindful of is the assurance of where each of those components and subcomponents are coming from. So manufacturer agreed complete waste of, would be too expensive to do it. So it'd be more important to understand where each of those subcomponents are coming from. So we have, from a cyber point of view, part of my business is cyber, is understanding where each element on the chip is coming from and making sure we've got that under control, and we're a long, long way away from that at the moment. So I think, I'm probably more concerned by that than someone taking out South Korea.
Well, just before I ask our President, Michael Howard, to wrap up, I'd like to thank our speakers. I'd like to just indicate that Alex and Ken forgot to say one very important point, is why the Williamstown Defence Hub is so vital and why it's so attractive. It was just 20 minutes down the road is Port Stephens, which is a wonderful part of New South Wales. But I think you understand, and this has been a wonderful opportunity to see the connectivity and the importance of the university sector, defence industry, and the government response to the defence industry, which is state by state as well as the federal government. And so it's very much a partnership. in taking and moving forward with defence in relation to defence capability. And I know that people would agree that at some stage, not too distant in the past, defence would turn the dollars on or off, and the defence industry would suffer accordingly. Now it's very much a partnership. And there's lots of challenges there, but nevertheless, thank you for articulating and making such wonderful presentations. I'm an Apple user. What's this strange thing I'm working? PC. There we go. It's my great pleasure to be able to sum up, and I hope it is your pleasure that I'm going to make it brief. I've just found today really productive, and I'd like to thank everyone who firstly is here, and secondly, in a moment, the people who've made it so valuable. But before doing that, could I just take the opportunity of reminding you of what we've got coming up as RUSI New South Wales over the next few months. And even if you could just tell people about it, we'd be very grateful. Every year in December, we ask a significant media person to do a year in review. And this particular year, we've got Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald, who was doing the year in review. Sorry, that was me. We're having a Christmas lunch at the Castlereagh. I have no idea what's doing that, my apologies. And if you could join us, you'd be very welcome. Our website has the detail. In January, we have one of our RUSI members, Captain Chris Skinner, talking about the OSAC agreement, if that's the correct way to pronounce it, and I suspect it's not, but at least it got your attention. And also, could I comment that Chris has deliberately been asked to look at some of the implications of it downstream, rather than just the sort of political froth and bubble of, are we going to or are we not going to have, etc. In February, it's not here, but I can indicate, we've asked Kim Osley if he could come back and expand further on the New South Wales Defence Advocate role. And in March, we have the Air Combat Group speaking on the F-35 and the Loyal Wingman program. So can I comment that I hope that you'll find that we're still attempting to be relevant, we're still attempting to provide informed debate, and I hope in that sense you'll assist us by at least saying to people, had a good day, and by the way, they've got some good stuff coming, check their website. Because quite frankly, that's what most people do anyway. The role of RUSI is to inform and promote debate on defence and security studies issues, and I'd like to just give you a couple of reflections of, surely like me, you sat there listening to a range of extremely influential and extremely significant people sharing their ideas with us. So here are some of the things that simply I resonated to. I grew up in a military culture where the three services were relatively independent, trained independently, and frankly at times were their own enemy rather than their own friend and cooperator. I have a son who grew up in the ADFA-based culture where they trained together, and I noticed an enormous difference in his attitude towards the other two services compared to mine in a similar earlier phase. I served in Vietnam, as some of you did, and I've got to say to you that that old culture was still very active at that time. So I would like to comment on, would you notice a theme that occurred to me? Defence and universities and industry were talking about partnerships and cooperation and sharing and solving things together, rather than we're the bloody army and what the hell are you doing, which is the old sort of mindset culture. That resonated very strongly with me, and I'd like to simply say, I hope that you're sitting here thinking, yeah, some things have resonated pretty strongly for me too. They don't have to be what resonated for me, but I hope something resonated with you, and you're taking it away. Could I comment how much the media is both highly relevant and irrelevant at this time? Have you ever noticed that the predictions of elections don't happen. The media is predicting X, the media is predicting Y, and then the Australian people vote. And then someone says, what the hell happened to all the predictions? And one of the real issues that RUSI, I think, should contribute to is the growing gap between defence and the understandings of the public as to what defence is doing. Post 9/11, you can't get onto a defence base. Post 9/11, you're almost regarded as, you're automatically an enemy if you're trying to go inside and have a look. Even bases like, that classic old Cerberus down at Jervis Bay, Creswell at Jervis Bay. So there is a gap. And have you ever noticed that in the gap about COVID, the internet filled the gap? The conspiracy theories, what's going on? What the hell are they doing in there? So one of the roles that I'm going to challenge RUSI for is, can we be part of that bridge and communication into the community to say, here's a chance. And one option of that is today's broadcast. It's an open webcast so that the community could look at it. So can I commend to your network and friends, do you know the Fleet Commander? Do you know the Forces Commander? Do you know the Air Commander? Or would you like to have a look at them? Webcast. So I hope and share with you that we will challenge and take on this challenge, but there are some wider issues than that, and I'd like to finish on the last of them. And Alex, you resonate with this. The old view of universities could be summed up by two quotes, one from Henry Kissinger: arguments at universities are so fierce because they're over so little. And the second one is, a university is a collection of warring tribes only united by their hatred of the parking policy. And so could I share with you that one of the things that universities have to learn to do, and in my opinion are beginning to learn to do, is cooperate. One of the greatest reforms would be to change the nature of what a PhD means. A PhD is an isolated, long-term experience in research. So does that suit you to cooperate? When I teach in the MBA, we are increasingly teaching them as teams rather than individuals. So one of the reforms of the university that you should also encourage is the possibility that we should change and explore our academic system in order to assist with cooperation. I'm just trying to make a point that it's not a one-way street, but everybody's saying you guys should be doing that to help us. Finally, could I thank those people who have appeared and presented today. But there's another group that I wanted to acknowledge just before the main presenters, and that's what we call our Program Education and Advisory Committee. And that's an elaborate way of saying their boss nominated them to help us. But we have a group in the PAC in no particular significance, just as I can identify them. We've got Commander Hamish Fraser, we've got Colonel Jody Lording, we've got Peter Ball from Talis, we've got Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Luciani, who isn't able to be with us today, but is part of that panel. And quite frankly, they are very valuable people indeed, because they can reflect, they can ask upwards if they have to, and a lot of the success of the program and the future program comes through that network. To the PAC members, thank you very much. Thank you. Can I just finish by saying how valuable and what a great experience has been to have our patron, our vice patrons and our key supporters like Kim Osley give up their time today. I mean, many of you must have some insight but probably not real awareness of the kind of day these people actually had. I'm sure they will now go back to a quiet space and have the day they wanted to have after they gave us the day that we asked of them, because that's the reality of their job. But I say to you, gentlemen, to the Fleet Commander, the Forces Commander and the Air Commander, through you, Peter, to Chris, the CEO of Talis, Australia, New Zealand, through you, Jody, to the Commander 2nd Division, thank you so much.
And look, it just seems to me that what's been an enormously valuable experience is to meet the people who are, you know, they're the people where the rubber hits the road. They're the people who are making it happen. And I think, Alex, it's particularly valuable with your dual background of DSTG and now the University of Newcastle. Thank you so much for giving up what is really a very full day, because you had to travel down and you're travelling back, and thank you. I hope that you have enjoyed the day. I'm certainly going to review the webcast, if for no other reason that we volunteered to make a publication out of this, and we will. So could I thank you all for coming? Could I thank the Cove technical people for the fact that they're broadcasting and webcasting this? And could I finish off by particularly acknowledging and thanking our compere moderator of the day, Major General Paul Irving. Thanks, Paul, so much for the very calm and efficient way you steered this lot together, and we really thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to conclude the seminar. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for being here. Thanks very much.